I'm here down in Salt Lake City at Rocky Anderson's headquarters. He's running for President of these United States. I appreciate the opportunity to interview you for YouTube.
Well, thank you.
So how is the campaign going so far?
It's going great. We've got really good volunteers throughout the country, state parties forming. We're getting on more and more state ballots. We've got a road team out working on that. We've got volunteers in several states working to get us on their state ballots. And I think that we're doing a fairly good job at getting the word out, both through social media and through the regular media. I think that there's probably been more national media attention on this race than all the other third parties combined. And for that I'm very grateful, because that's really what this is all about, is communicating our message, raising consciousness about the challenges that we're faced with in this country, the way things are headed, what the solutions are that we're advocating, and empowering people, seeing what we can do to get people organized and mobilized so that we can all be far more unified in pushing for change that will serve the public interest rather than simply the interests of the very wealthy who have control of what happens in Washington today.
So you mentioned that you are in the mainstream media, you are getting coverage. Do you feel like they're treating you fairly? Do you think that they're giving you adequate coverage?
No, I don't think the mainstream media is giving us adequate coverage at all, especially given the fact that people who identify themselves as independents now are greater in number than those who identify themselves as either Republicans or Democrats. There are millions of people leaving both the Republican and Democratic parties. The approval rating of Congress hit a historic low of 9% approval this last year. The polls all show that the majority of people want to see third-party and independent alternatives to the Democratic and Republican candidates for president. So there are all those indicators that the people of this country want to see things go in a very different way. We'll never see the corrupting influence of money out of government if we don't move away from this duopoly of the Republican and Democratic parties.
So you say the independents now outnumber Democrats and Republicans in this country. That's a fact that I also became aware of recently. Do you think that people are ready to stop voting for Republicans and Democrats? They're leaving the Democratic and Republican Party in droves. Are they actually ready to face this issue that is commonly referred to as the spoiler effect, where they say, oh, Rocky Anderson, he's just a spoiler? What do you make of that?
Well, I think that especially given the trauma that this country went through in 2000, and the Democratic Party's been very successful in trying to make it seem that that was all Ralph Nader's fault, which is so ludicrous, because obviously it was Al Gore and his campaign's doing, and I think a really terrible vice presidential candidate in Joe Lieberman, but they ran a lousy campaign. There were some 200,000 or 300,000 Florida Democrats who voted for George Bush. Al Gore lost his own home state. The Supreme Court stole the election, wouldn't even allow the recount of the ballots to continue on. There were so many. We know that people by the thousands were disenfranchised in Florida by the Republican officials there. So there are a lot of factors to that. So I think we need to get over that, but more importantly, we need to understand that we're never going to see change in this country if we simply always let that concern about the greater of the two evils winning, rather than saying we're all of us going to vote for an alternative to the Democratic and Republican parties, even if it means that the election might be won by somebody that we really don't want to see win. That unless we break out of this fear that the lesser of two evils might lose the election, we're never going to see the kind of change we need. And in this instance, I think President Obama is not just the lesser of two evils, he's the more effective of the two evils. Because he's doing things, he's getting away with things just because he's got a D on his jersey that a Republican president would never get away with, and certainly wouldn't get away with without major opposition from the Democratic Party. But when it's done by President Obama, because he's a Democrat, the Democrats just shut up about it. They don't rise up in opposition. Can you imagine if George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld were sitting around in the Oval Office examining these baseball card-like biographies of suspected terrorists, deciding who's going to win, who's going to live, and who's going to die, and knowing that in the process, hundreds of innocent men, women, and children, civilians, are going to be killed in the process? Can you imagine what the Democratic Party, what mainstream Democrats would be doing? They'd be out in the streets, there'd be demonstrations, there would be calls for impeachment, there would be congressional investigations, congressional subpoenas issued. But since it's a Democrat, they don't do anything about it. It is the worst of the team sport mentality in our body politic. And we need to get away from that and understand that to keep this person in power, we're going to see more and more abuses. We're going to see a further ratcheting up of a very dangerous imperial presidency. We're going to see more of an inclination toward president-made wars that are completely in violation of the War Power Clause of the Constitution. A president who signs into law a provision that allows the government to indefinitely detain people without charges, trial, legal assistance, without the right of habeas corpus. But since it's a Democrat, this subversive legislation, I think probably the most anti-American thing a president and Congress have ever done. And yet, to look around, you'd think this is the most complacent nation on the face of the planet as we march toward totalitarianism, as we march toward a sort of fascism. It really was through complacency in Europe that allowed fascism to creep in. And we're not above that. We're seeing these very kinds of things happening in this country. But he's getting away with it because he's a Democrat, and that hence the Democrats don't do anything in opposition. I mean, this is a president who is targeting U.S. citizens for assassination. When did that ever happen in this nation? Due process clause says the government may not deprive anyone of their life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the president sitting around with his national security advisors, looking at these baseball card biographies and deciding who's going to live and who's going to die, that's not due process. But that's how bad it's become. And President Obama's not going to be there forever. We're going to get somebody else like a Mitt Romney, like a George Bush. And really, we're going to give the President of the United States those kinds of tyrannical powers? So we need to make changes, and we need to make them now. And there's a third corollary to these arguments against the spoiler argument, and that is every one of us individually, really, when we go in to cast our ballot, we ought to be capable of drawing not only a political line in the sand, but a moral line in the sand. And be able to say in 20 and 30 years looking back, I did not support a president who did the kinds of things, or failed to do the kinds of things President Obama has, to break the promises that he has. And they are numerous, dozens of promises that were made to the people of this country. He said 4 years ago he wasn't taking any money, not one nickel, from Washington, D.C. lobbyists. And yet, his major contributors were partners in law firms that were making millions of dollars as lobbyists. That's pretty deceitful in the midst of a campaign to make that claim. And then when we realize that he was taking in his money from these lobbyists and from Wall Street firms and from employees of Wall Street firms. President Obama took in about $1 million from a Goldman Sachs PAC and from employees of Goldman Sachs. That's from one Wall Street firm. And then he surrounds himself with all these people. So when we know that these things are going on, and the major human rights and civil rights abuses and the warmongering and empire building and caving to Wall Street with no accountability for the massive fraud, when we know those things are going on, we've got to be able to draw the line and say, I will not support that person, even if there is somebody worse, because there's always going to be somebody worse. That's going to happen in every election. You can always point to, well, let's see, I like this person better than this one, but they're both really bad. So if we want to see change, it's up to us.
So Obama has done some bad things. I think we both agree with that. And you know, I'm not unbiased here. I'm not a fan of Romney. How would you be better? What have you done in your career that proves that you'd be a better alternative to either one of them?
Well, my whole adult life has been dedicated to breathing life into our Constitution, fighting for people who have suffered injury as a result of abuses of power, either corporate power or governmental power. I've worked really hard to combat climate change and to organize people and to educate and to bring about the urgent changes we need in that area. And that's the biggest issue really we're facing. I know it doesn't resonate with voters for some reason, but the ramifications from climate change are going to be greater than anything else that we're talking about. So while Mitt Romney spent his adult life amassing a huge fortune, building up Bain Capital, going around and buying and selling companies and firing people in the process and maybe outsourcing jobs to other nations. Well, President Obama, although he graduated from law school, I don't think he ever tried a case. I don't think he ever argued an appeal. I don't think he even wrote a law review article. I don't know how it was he was teaching at one of the best law schools in the country. But he's teaching constitutional law, then he comes in as president and completely disregards the rule of law, saying like a tyrant, well, I'm going to decide which laws are going to be applied against whom and under what circumstances. You know, what business does any one person in the United States of America have saying, well, as to these violations of the War Crimes Act, or these violations of the Convention Against Torture, the Geneva Convention, or these violations of our federal anti-torture statute. Let's just forget about them. Let's just move forward and not look backwards. Who gets to do that? No one gets to do that in a country that abides by the rule of law. And I've been fighting for equal justice my entire adult life. I did it for 21 years as a practicing lawyer. I handled a lot of civil rights cases. I fought for people who were going to lose their life savings in financial institutions. And a lot of this I did pro bono, without pay, because I believe in our system. I believe in the rule of law. I believe in these constitutional values that have been completely disregarded by President Obama, and that I think would be completely disregarded by Mitt Romney. I also have infinitely more managerial and executive experience than President Obama had before he walked into the White House. I was over more than a $200 million budget for 8 years as mayor, plus a huge RDA budget and the chief operating officer of a major international airport. So I think if you look at values, if you look at what the core of the person is, where our values are, where our passions are, whether we approach public life with integrity and in our personal lives, I think I'm far more qualified than either Mitt Romney or Barack Obama.
Well, believe it or not, we're already approaching 16 minutes, and I know you wanted to keep it around 15. There are a few more questions I wanted to ask on issues, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. What do you think about the war on drugs?
The war on drugs has been a total failure. I've been speaking out against the war on drugs for years. That's why the Drug Policy Alliance gave me their highest national award. I've spoken at conferences. I spoke at the Shadow Convention in 2000. At the same time, Democratic Convention was being held, and the purpose was to address issues that neither of the major parties were addressing, and I addressed the utter failure and futility and tragedy of the war on drugs. We need to treat drugs the same way we do alcohol, the same way we do tobacco. It ought to be first and foremost a matter of public health education and treatment on demand. It shouldn't be in the criminal justice system. Drugs need to be regulated and taxed, but they shouldn't be treated differently than alcohol.
Another presidential candidate, the Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson, also has been a vigorous opponent of the war on drugs. Would you be interested in any kind of an alliance on that issue and any other issues you might agree with him on?
Gary Johnson and I actually spoke at the same Shadow Convention. That's when we first got to know each other. And he and I are very aligned on the issue of drugs. I have been very active in that. I don't know that he ever actually did anything about it. I killed the DARE program. It's one of the first things I did when I came in as mayor, because it's completely ineffective.
He did pardon some nonviolent marijuana offenders when he was governor of New Mexico.
I gained a presidential pardon from President Clinton the last day he was in office for a man who was in a federal penitentiary and was facing another 10 years on his first drug convictions. So I've been fighting these battles for a long time. I'd love to work with Gary on those kinds of issues. Unfortunately, we're not really able to team up as running mates, because I completely disagree with the libertarian approach to basically their hostility toward government, because there's so much that government can do to promote the public health, safety, and welfare. And among those things that I think is absolutely crucial is leadership on climate change and the protection of our air and water to make them safe. A libertarian approach would basically leave it laissez-faire for the corporate community to do, and that would not be a good thing for the rest of us. And ignoring climate change is going to be a very bad thing for our children and later generations.
Speaking on corporate influence, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, is in town for their convention, and there's the ALEC Welcoming Committee there to protest it in town. Do you have any thoughts on ALEC or the protests that are happening?
Yeah, I would love to see thousands of people come out and make it very painful for ALEC sponsors to continue on. A lot of companies are dropping out as sponsors of ALEC because of this kind of opposition, and the more grassroots opposition there is, and again, it's ordinary people providing the leadership that's not being provided elsewhere. This is a good way to challenge it. Unfortunately, I'm probably going to be in Washington, D.C. During the time that ALEC is here, but I'd love to be joining the Welcoming Committee, and I really congratulate those who are organizing it and those who will show up, because we all need to express our dissatisfaction with what ALEC does and what the legislators who cave to ALEC's requests are doing to our communities. You know, there is no counterpoint to ALEC. ALEC is sponsored by these companies that will throw all this money at them. They give these legislators their boondoggles and hold their conferences, and they, I'm sure, get campaign contributions for legislators that buy into their program. There is no public interest counterpoint to that. There's no organization that represents the public interest that is pulling this money together to hold conferences and provide these boondoggles for legislators. It just simply needs to be opposed in every way
So
possible.
what's the solution to that basically massive corruption?
Well, we need to get the corrupting influence of money out of government, or we're always going to see money control, both in Washington and in our own state capitals. And the number one thing is to get rid of this notion that corporations have the same constitutional rights as people, and to strictly limit campaign contributions.
So repealing Citizens United, would you be in favor of that?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And even if it took restricting the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court or a constitutional amendment. Our democracy really depends on getting this corrupting influence of money out of government. But it doesn't stop with campaigns. And it wasn't just created, this perverse, corrupt system didn't only come about after the Citizens United case. It was there for a long time before. I used to sit on the board of Utah Common Cause, and we're fighting that kind of corruption many, many years ago. So it's been with us a long time. And the answer is strict limits on the kind of money that comes in, providing free and equal access on the public airwaves for candidates, and allowing far greater access so that people can hear the message from candidates other than from just the duopoly of the Republican and Democratic parties.
Okay, thank you. There are a lot more questions that I could ask you, but I know that you have a tight schedule. What would you like to say in conclusion?
Well, I think that it's so fundamentally important for everyone to understand that it's up to us. You can't become cynical and resigned, say you're not going to vote, you're not going to register, you're not going to be involved in the political process. To do that is to simply wave the white flag of defeat. You're part of the problem if you're not going to participate, if you're not going to challenge the wrongdoing in every way possible. We are the leaders. The elected officials, those people in Washington, those people in our state houses, they're not the leaders by and large. They're the ones that follow where they think we're leading. Jim Wallace put it beautifully when he said, these folks go back to Washington, these elected officials, and it's true locally as well with our local elected officials. They lick their finger, put them up in the air, and see where the political winds are blowing, and that's where they go. And our job is to change the wind. Let them see that they're going to pay a political price if they don't do the right thing, if they don't do what's in the public interest. So really, we can't avoid that responsibility. And if we decide to sit it out, we're simply supporting the status quo.
Thank you. That reminds me, one more question. Can you speak to jury nullification real quick before we end this?
Jury nullification? It's an important concept in our jurisprudence, and I think jurors, since it is part of the law, ought to be advised by the court in appropriate cases about jury nullification, that they really do have the right to disregard the law.
That's like another check on the branches of government, isn't it? Isn't it like a fourth branch of government where the people, even though an unjust law has been passed or a law is being applied in an unfair manner, the jury is like that last the jury has the right to basically set aside that law, even if the person can, is proven to have done an act that's illegal. The jury has the right to judge that law, the law itself, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, but they're told exactly the opposite. Jurors are instructed that they must follow the law. Here's the law. It's for them to determine the facts and how the facts fit in under the law. But what's not being told to the jury is that they are capable, under the law, of nullifying the law by saying that either the law is unjust or that to apply the law to this case is unjust.
And how can the courts justify instructing a jury the opposite of what is true under the Constitution?
You have to ask the courts what they have in mind. I think that most judges feel very strongly that the rule of law requires that the law be applied, that that's a jury's function to determine the facts and apply to the law to the facts. And that is certainly almost always the case. I'm a big believer in the rule of law as well. But in those extraordinary cases where it's a matter of conscience and where there are fundamental issues of justice, I think that in those unique, very extraordinary cases, it is indeed appropriate for a court to advise a jury that it has the right to nullify.
Now, to inform them of the opposite, that's kind of a usurpation of power from the jury and into more power for the judge and less power for the jury. Isn't that kind of an unconstitutional usurpation of power?
No, I don't think it's a
Not really?
constitutional usurpation. No.
No. It's a legal usurpation?
Yeah. No, I don't think it's a... I think, again, in the extraordinary case where jury nullification might be appropriate, then it is inconsistent for the court to say you must follow the law and apply the facts to the law.
Let's say for like a simple cannabis possession, somebody took it to a jury trial. That jury has the right to say, well, these drug laws are illegal laws, or that we just don't want to apply this law anymore, much like they did under alcohol prohibition. They have the right to do that, right?
I don't think in that case, I don't think to generally say that this law, that they disagree with this law. That would be really the usurpation by 12 people of our whole democratic system. We elect people to make our laws. We don't elect these 12 jurors to make our laws for us. So then you're going to come up with an incredibly unjust result, because one jury in one case might say those laws are wrong, but in every other case, people are held accountable under those laws.
Well, now that a majority of people in the country...
We've gone like 15
Okay,
minutes.
yeah, sorry for the false conclusion earlier.
That's all right.
We can wrap it up. Sorry about the false conclusion earlier. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, I think we've covered it.
Okay, thanks. Can I come back again?
Sure.
All right, thank you very much for the interview, Mr. Anderson.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure.